Just over 180 years ago, a writer working with an illustrator conjured up an image that became one of the most famous and influential food-filled works of art in history. The year was 1843, and the 26-year-old illustrator, John Leech, was turning the words of a 31-year-old Charles Dickens into pictures. And so, on a page of A Christmas Carol, there it is, a room with bare wooden floorboards and two figures, one of which is surrounded by the most enticing-looking feast. It's the ghost of Christmas Present.
Who's this huge figure, dressed a bit like Father Christmas, but in a green kind of coloured cape, and a very startled, frightened-looking Scrooge.
Heaped on the floor were turkeys, geese, game, poultry, brawn. Great joints of meat, sucking pigs, long wreaths of sausages, mince pies, barrels of oysters, red-hot chestnuts, cherry-cheeked apples, juicy oranges, luscious pears, and seething bowls of punch. And amongst them sat a jolly giant, glorious to see.
And if you look very carefully, you can see that his right foot is on a plum pudding, one of those sort of round cannonball types of plum pudding, and his left foot is on a 12th cake, which was the thing that you had at the very end of the 12 days. The plum pudding is the food of Christmas Day, so you basically got a kind of culinary calendar there of the whole Christmas festival in this wonderful image. There are also two bowls of a smoking, steaming punch, bishop, but it's largely lost on a 21st century audience.
Well, I think in this programme we will be explaining this image and tasting some of it.
Yeah.
Spirit, conduct me where you will.
Touch my robe.
Scrooge did what he was told and held it fast. Holly, mistletoe, red berries, ivy, turkeys, geese, game, poultry, brawn, meat, sausages, oysters, pies, puddings and fruit all vanished instantly.
If you're listening to this with some leftover turkey in the fridge, at this point, Christmas was only just getting underway for Dickens. The best was yet to come. And it's the food stories captured in John Leech's 1843 image that give us all a reason to keep the celebrations going until the end, the 12th day of Christmas. Food historian Ivan Day.
I think it was the biggest party there was in the whole of this country. And there's some amazing illustrations of 12 night revels. This is like the party to end all parties, really, you know. This is one of the reasons why Queen Victoria was not that keen on it, because people would get out of control. It was when people let their hair down, really, before the winter really set in. And I've never been to a party that good.
And as well as all the partying, the 12th day of Christmas was when a food highlight of the entire year was ready to eat. One that in John Leech's image we see placed under the ghost's left foot, a 12th cake.
It's a very old tradition. I mean, we call it 12th cake, but originally in this country it was called wassail cake, and the first records of it are from Yorkshire. And it talks about the wassail cake being distributed to everyone during the 12th night festivities.
And in this programme, we'll also find out how the big spherical plum pudding under the ghost's right foot became Christmas pudding, all with the help of clues left behind by a group of starving British sailors stranded in the Americas.
With only about 6 survivors, they suddenly realise it's Christmas Day. The ship's cook remembers down in the hold there's a barrel, and he remembered it'd got some meal in it, and he finds a few raisins, and he makes what he calls a Christmas pudding. And that is the first term, and you're talking about, 1658, something like that.
But first, let's hear how and why that image of the ghost of Christmas Present, surrounded by all that food, came into existence. For that, I went to one of Charles Dickens's London homes, 48 Doughty Street, a Georgian house just a few minutes' walk from Chancery Lane and King's Cross Station. Outside, I met our second food historian, writer Pen Vogler, and 180 years ago, these streets, like Leech's image, would have been filled with food.
What comes to mind for me is how busy it would have been. And it really comes through in Dickens' work when he talks about, for example, the muffin delivery boys, in Nicholas Nickleby. And you know that people would have been delivering tiny things, just some watercresses from the market or ham sandwiches or something.
And the very first meal eaten in A Christmas Carol wasn't eaten at home. It was on Scrooge's walk home through the streets of London.
Scrooge took his melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern, and having read all the newspapers and beguiled the rest of the evening with his banker's book, went home to bed.
In Dickens's London, there was a massive economy of street food. And Dickens's friend and colleague, Henry Mayhew, describes in a massive kind of 3-volume book called London Labour and the London Poor, describes how people feed themselves and how you could just buy almost anything.
I found it common among the street sellers of eatables and drinkables to describe themselves and their fraternity not by their names or callings, but by the articles in which they deal. This is sometimes ludicrous. "Sir, is the man you're asking about a pickled whelk?" was said to me. The street provisions consist of cooked or prepared victuals, hot eels, baked potatoes, oysters, sheep's trotters, pea soup, fried fish, ham sandwiches, hot green peas, kidney puddings, boiled meat puddings, beef, mutton, kidney and eel pies, and pickled whelks. In each of these provisions, the street poor find a midday or a midnight meal.
And for a lot of people who didn't have kitchens, that's what they did. They just had to buy food in. For people like Scrooge, he wouldn't have been too poor to have a servant, but he might have been too miserly to have a servant. And he would have eaten very regularly in a tavern or a chop house or something like that, which is what Dickens is describing.
He lived in chambers which had once belonged to his deceased partner. They were a gloomy suite of rooms in a lowering pile of building up a yard, where the fog and frost hung about the black old gateway.
48 Doughty Street, the place where Dickens wrote Oliver Twist, is now a museum. Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
So I'm Emma Harper and I'm curator at the Charles Dickens Museum. Dickens moved around a lot. He had a lot of homes by the time he moved into Doughty Street when he was 25. So we're in 1837. He was quite a young man, but it's sort of the first house that really says that he's making something of himself. So when he arrives, he's just finishing Pickwick Papers, and that's the sort of first novel that gives him real success. He's still doing some journalist work, writing articles, but then whilst he's here, he writes Oliver Twist, Nicholas Nickleby and starts Barnaby Rudge, all in under 2 years. So he moves in with his wife Catherine and their first son Charles, and they have 2 more children when he's here. He was a prolific walker and often had insomnia, so he would have walked out of this front door at 48 Doughty Street into the streets of London and seen all parts of life there and really absorbed them and put them in his novels. So, for example, 10 minutes down the road towards Farringdon, you've got where Fagin's gang hangs out in Oliver Twist.
We are very glad to see you, Oliver, very. Dodger, take off the sausages and draw a tubney of the fire for Oliver. There are a good many of them, ain't there?
Pen Vogler.
I wrote a book called Dinner with Dickens, which is really a collection of recipes inspired by his life and work, because he writes about food all the time. And for him, food is about so much. It's about emotion, it's about family love, it's about feeling, it's about status, it's about some terrible stuff, it's about emptiness. And it's difficult to kind of categorise, but every meal, every bit of food in Dickens is kind of meaningful. And there's so much. And then it really begins to unwrap what is going on in London, in Britain at the time. What the kind of social relations are between people, what was important to people, and the terrible things that he writes about, the hunger, insecurity, kids being denied food, denied love. But it unlocked for me this enormous world about where food represents so much more. It's a kind of portal onto everything that we discover about ourselves, about our relationships with each other.
It looks like quite a small house. It's quite narrow, it's quite thin. But as we go in, it opens up, and then as we go up, there are many, many floors. And one thing I've learnt working here is all the stairs. This is the study of Doughty Street, and this is where Dickens wrote his stories. So he wrote Oliver Twist and Nicholas Nickleby here, and in front of us are his desk and his sort of wicker cane-bottomed chair, and this is actually his last desk and chair from his home at Gad's Hill. So on this desk he wrote Great Expectations and would have been writing The Mystery of Edwin Drood when he died. And actually that is also set around Christmas times.
It's amazing to see this combination of being in a room where some of the most famous novels ever were written, and a desk from another place where even more novels were written. Did he write, was he a home writer, or did he write in quiet libraries elsewhere?
He wrote wherever he was, but that was generally either his home or his office. So he would garner ideas when he was out walking. But he had quite a good schedule. He liked to work in the mornings. He would get up fairly early, work until about 2:00, and then would go out walking. Always did, I think it's at least 6 miles a day, but he was a fast walker. And then in the evenings, that's where he would do some of his charity work and also, of course, entertain. Now we're in the dining room at 48 Doughty Street, and it is set for dinner.
We don't have any accounts of a specific Christmas meal Dickens ate, but we do know it would have featured some of the foods in Leach's illustration.
There will have been some joints of meat in the on the table. There will have probably been pies at the same time, little what we call corner dishes, and in the corner dishes there might have been some sausages. It really fits his way of companionship because everybody will carve for each other, will offer each other wine. It's very communal. And so that would be a sort of ordinary, quite meaty, quite celebratory feast.
And from the desk in Doughty Street in the pen of Dickens, the Christmas meal of others was also captured.
He gives us a Christmas meal in Great Expectations. It's a rural family feast. It's quite modest in a way. It's quite meaty. There's a leg of pickled pork, 2 roast fowls, a pork pie.
Some of which, of course, Pip steals to take to the escaped convict, Magwitch.
From the pantry, which was far more abundantly supplied than usual, it being Christmas, I stole some bread, some rind of cheese, about half a jar of mincemeat, some brandy from a stone bottle, a meat bone with very little on it, and a beautiful, round, compact pork pie. It had been so carefully covered in a corner that I took it, hoping it was not intended for early use and would not be missed for some time.
Oh! It's gone! Gone!
It's hard to overstate the status of a good pie in the 19th century. Before refrigeration, meat could be packed inside a sealed pastry casing smeared in fat, making it airtight. This was a luxurious and practical food.
In the agricultural year, most people were competing with livestock for grain over winter, until we learnt to kind of keep them alive kind of for longer, and we imported food and all the rest of it. And so you slaughtered your animals in November and December. Pork doesn't keep very well, so fresh pork would be rare by Christmas. So a pork pie that they're all Mr. Pumblechook's pork pie, they're all very excited about eating, not realising that Pip has given it away. Sorry if that's a spoiler alert. Might be quite a rare thing for them, because after that they'd be having just sort of salted bacon and salted pork for the rest of the time. And pies were very sturdy, make excellent gifts because, they can travel well. And of course the mince pie, this is the thing that lets Pip off the hook because his sister's already made the mince pie, so he can give the mincemeat away. And they were then, as now, a major part of kind of people's Christmas celebrations.
In the image, just behind a pile of pies and between the ghost's feet, is a goose. The bird that the Cratchits and other working city dwellers at the time would have at their Christmas table. Theirs is an urban existence, and so, like millions of others, cooking would often be communal.
Cratchits, we know, didn't even have an oven because they had to send their goose to the bakers to be cooked. And there's two scenes actually in Christmas Carol where Dickens talks about people taking, their Christmas meat to the bakers. And there's this lovely sort of, expression in A Christmas Carol where the children have been standing outside the bakers and sniffing, and they think they can sniff their own goose, that it's the best smell, and their own sage and onion stuffing, and it's the best of all of them.
And now the two smaller Cratchits, boy and girl, came tearing in, screaming that outside the baker's they'd smelt the goose and known it for their own. And, basking in luxurious thoughts of sage and onion, these young Cratchits danced about the table and exalted Master Peter Cratchit to the skies, whilst he blew the fire until the slow potatoes bubbling up knocked loudly at the saucepan lid to be let out and peeled.
And because of their limited kitchen, Mrs. Cratchit boils the food seen beneath the ghost's right foot, the plum pudding, in the container used to wash clothes, one of which is still in Dickens's old house in Doughty Street.
So we're now standing in the wash house. It's noticeably colder and damper even to this day, but the feature is the original copper in the corner. And whilst the Dickenses have a big kitchen in which to cook their Christmas dinner and their Christmas pudding, not every family would, as we've discussed. And in A Christmas Carol, Dickens describes the Cratchit family cooking their Christmas dinner in their wash copper.
Mrs. Cratchit left the room alone to bring in the pudding. In half a minute she returned, flushed but smiling proudly, with the pudding like a speckled cannonball blazing in a half-quartern of ignited brandy. Oh, a wonderful pudding. Everybody had something to say about it, but nobody said or thought it was at all a small pudding.
But what the Cratchits didn't have, what they could never really have afforded, is the food placed under the ghost's left foot, the giant 12th cake. And in Doughty Street, that story is told in the smallest room at the top of the house, the nursery.
It's dressed more for the Dickens children themselves, and it's dressed for the 12th night party. Now, 12th night had a particular significance for the Dickens family because the 6th of January was their eldest child, Charlie's, birthday. So for them, Christmas Day wasn't the focus that it is today. It was the whole 12 days of Christmas. And for them, the culmination was the party on Charlie's birthday on 12th night. And we know that his godmother, Angela Burdett-Coutts, a very good friend of Dickens, every year she brings for Charlie the 12th night cake.
12th night cake is...
We would today call it a Christmas cake. It's the same thing. It's a delicious fruit cake. They decorated them slightly differently. They're fantastic descriptions of 12th night cakes with decorations of castles and mermaids and stars and birds and trees, wonderful things. And there's a lovely story about the Angela Burdett-Coutts 12th cake that she gives to the family, and it follows them all the way to Genoa where they're staying, and the icing gets a little bit chipped on the way, so Dickens gets it sent to the local pastry cook who mends the icing and then displays it in the local window, and all the townsfolk come around and kind of marvel at this wonderful, beautifully decorated cake.
In any other book, descriptions of food and their images could easily have been marginal and forgotten. But when A Christmas Carol was published, Dickens was, perhaps, the most celebrated and influential public figure in the world. Think of the impact of the Beatles in the mid-1960s and double it. And so through the story of Scrooge and the themes of meanness, poverty, ignorance and want, Dickens tells a story that ends up cementing the association between a specific day and specific foods.
So A Christmas Carol came out on the 19th of December 1843, and by Christmas Eve, its 6,000 copies of its first print run had sold out. It continues to be published, so I think by May you're on the 7th or 8th print run. So its momentum is carrying on.
There's a very famous story about on his death in 1870 when it's reported in the paper, and some young girl says, "Charles Dickens dead. Does that mean Father Christmas will die too?" Because he becomes so associated in the public imagination with Christmas. I think at the time what Dickens was doing is creating an urban family Christmas out and almost creating a tradition from scratch, which was very resonant, very powerful for people, because there was a huge amount of kind of social upheaval at the time. People were leaving the countryside, leaving these old-fashioned kind of bonds of responsibility. And people would have come, farm workers, agricultural labourers would have come from a countryside with a landowner or a farmer who might have exploited them most of the time, but at Christmas would have been responsible for them, would have made sure they had a rabbit or bullock's heart or chicken or something on their plate. They'd have had some meat on their and their family's table at Christmas. And that, of course, goes. It goes because of the enclosures, and it goes because those people move into cities, attracted by new industries, new businesses. But those bonds are gone. And that figure is what Scrooge is supposed to represent. He's supposed to be the urban person who has to learn those bonds of responsibility. He has to learn that he is just as responsible for his fellow human beings as he is for the amount of money he makes in businesses. And I think that was an incredibly resonant story for Victorians.
This is a very it's a major period of change in British society and economy as well. So we're seeing Britain rise to its status in terms of empire. There's a wave of globalization underway. Countries are more connected. Transportation more efficient and long-reaching as well. So Dickens is living and writing and eating at a time. I mean, I just think of the way in which China's changed in recent years, and Britain experiencing the same transformation in the 19th century.
Dickens is aware of global trade, but it's not his main interest. He's really interested about what is happening in Britain at the time. And what was happening in the 1840s, they were called the Hungry 40s. There was a lot of unemployment, there was a lot of new technology being brought in, people losing their jobs, things happening far across the world that we had no control over, but that affected British workers and British industry. And I think A Christmas Carol comes out of that anxiety that ordinary people who might be working incredibly hard, might be doing 2 jobs, suddenly can't feed their families any longer. And you can see that in this. They might be the most loving family, most supportive, and yet they might be close to hunger.
Yeah, and I think it's worth remembering a lot of people today might not be aware of that kind of underlying message and reason why Dickens wrote A Christmas Carol. He wrote it because he was upset about the new poor laws coming in. He felt that it was punishing the poorest in society rather than helping them. And he was responding to reports of, working conditions for children and things like this. And initially he was going to write a pamphlet. And he sort of stopped himself and he's like, no, I'll wait, because Nearer Christmas and a piece of fiction will have 20 times the force.
What we now know that few people did when Dickens was alive was that he had direct experience of deprivation and hunger. Here's the writer and campaigner J.B. Priestley speaking in praise of Dickens in 1943.
His early childhood had been reasonably secure, comfortable, pleasant. Then all was changed. His father was arrested for debt and sent to the Marshalsea prison. Young Charles even had to take his few books to the pawn shop. Then he was sent to work at the rat-infested old blacking warehouse by the river. He ate his breakfast and supper with the family in prison. To the little boy, who was rather delicate, nervous, though high-spirited, it was as if some horrible dark dream had closed in on him. What chiefly appalled him was the fact that his parents could allow this to happen to him. For when his father, who inherited a small legacy, came out of prison, Charles wasn't immediately taken away from the warehouse and sent back to school. And, this is the final wound, when his father finally did take him away from the blacking warehouse, his mother arranged that he should be sent back there. She didn't succeed, but the blow had been struck, and it was years before he could bring himself to mention this profound shock.
I do not write resentfully or angrily, for I know all these things have worked together to make me what I am. But I never afterwards forgot. I never shall forget. I never can.
And this from an interview with Monica Dickens, his great-granddaughter, recorded in 1970.
He, more than many people,
was very marked by his childhood experiences.
Oh, yes, he was, perhaps more than almost anyone one can think of, and outside of David Copperfield, which of course was direct autobiography, it comes up in all the books, the endless list of Dickens's deprived waifs, all of which were himself.
You can tell in Dickens's writing that in that period he knew what hunger was. He had experience, walking down the street, the smell of the bakery, the pangs in his stomach. He knew what it was to be in that situation. By couching his message in the story of A Christmas Carol, it is so much more powerful, and it's lasted today, hundreds, decades later.
And he was right, because Christmas Carol was his Sergeant Pepper, in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. What's interesting to me, though, is that in the many, many adaptations that have been of A Christmas Carol, there's basically a new one every single year, which shows its success and popularity. But you don't always get the characters of ignorance and want that the ghost shows Scrooge on his travels. The ghost opens up his cloak and these two children are there. He says, "Ghost, are they yours?" And the ghost replies, "No, they are mankind's, they are society's." And Dickens in this scene is trying to get across the message that everyone has a responsibility for, assisting their fellow members of society and getting across this social justice and social reform, which again is the reason that he's writing the novel in the first place.
And if you go to those figures, ignorance and want in A Christmas Carol, he's keenly aware that could have been him. Ignorance, because if he hadn't been to school, which he did eventually go back to school. Want, because he was so needy as a child, and he really knows how he could have turned up, if he hadn't, in the end, have worked very hard and been quite lucky.
And so, in the writing, the books, the characters, amidst all the darkness and cruelty, you'll find idealised visions of children, of family and food. And in A Christmas Carol, the happy ending doesn't only see a goose replaced with a more ample turkey, there's also a crucial moment captured in a shared drink. A drink which in Leech's image is seen as a steaming bowl below the ghost's left hand.
A Merry Christmas, Bob, a merrier Christmas, my good fellow, than I've given you for many a year. I'll raise your salary. We'll discuss your affairs this very afternoon over a Christmas bowl of smoking bishop.
To find out what Smoking Bishop is and to bring more of John Leech's illustrations to life, Pen Vogler and I have travelled to Cumbria and the home of food historian Ivan Day. It's a living museum with a kitchen filled with books, jelly moulds and cooking equipment spanning centuries. And the sound you can hear is the winding up of a clockwork contraption in front of a fierce coal fire.
It's the most incredible scene. There's a goose in front of the fire, which is really important because you don't roast something above the fire, it will just get burnt. It's very slowly turning on a clockwork spit, very ingenious.
Can you see the steam coming off it now? That means it's cooking, When the steam draws to the fire, the goose is cooked.
And this fat is dripping down onto some potatoes, which you can see going kind of golden brown and completely delicious looking underneath.
Now, I think that the Cratchits probably had boiled potatoes other than these wonderful roast potatoes, but these are ultra super roast potatoes. What you can't see inside this goose, I've used a really interesting sage and onion stuffing written by this wonderful French chef called Alexis Soyer 10 years after A Christmas Carol. And at the very end of the book, he says that afterthought, and he gives you these goose stuffing recipes. And this is sage and onion stuffing, but it's got the addition of boiled beetroots in it. And when you open it up, it's amazing. It looks just like you've pulled Father Christmas out of a goose.
The word goose and geese is really interesting because it's kept its Old English Germanic irregular plural, goose and geese, which suggests that it was always a bird of the farmyard rather than the elevated meat that the Normans, Anglo-Normans, would have eaten, because they turn all the words for animals into pork, beef, mutton. You know, they turn them into meat words, and you don't get that with goose. And that kind of suggests that it was always a slightly more kind of a bird of the people. And I think its association with Christmas is because it was much easier for people to have access to it.
A goose wasn't that important at Christmas originally. It was mainly consumed at the end of September because they would put the geese on the stubble. They're called stubble geese. And the geese would glean the grain, which was left behind after the harvesters had been there. And of course, they can eat it and get fat.
So when there was lots of common land available, it meant that most people in a village were allowed to kind of graze their animals on it. And there's a description by Cobbett, for example, of this area in Surrey, and he says you can hardly see the grass. There's 10,000 white geese in this area. They were everywhere, and they were walked, driven, I suppose, to London.
And really, the end of September was a day called Roast Goose Day, and that's when the majority of geese in this country got consumed. They always saved a number of them for Christmas and continue to fatten them up a little bit because they lose weight quite quickly.
But when that breaks down, you know, and people become much more urbanised, that common gets sort of replaced by goose clubs. And goose clubs are often run by publicans, and the temperance movement hated them because the idea was that you'd go to the pub, you might have a little drink, and you'd put some money in the goose club, and everybody wins, you know, except the temperance movements who don't like it. And at the end of the day, these geese would be raised in a kind of suburban yard, and you'd get a goose.
So for the Cratchits, I think the goose really is a kind of dream in a way, you know, to have a big bird, but it's wanting to give your family the kind of Christmas treat that their bosses were giving their families, I think.
Why did Scrooge substitute a goose for the Cratchits for turkey and not just buy them a bigger goose?
What Scrooge is doing, he's giving him replacing the goose, which is a little bit more kind of working person's meat, with this big, solid, meaty, generous turkey, which has got more social status to it.
And tasting Ivan's goose that had been spit roasted for 3 hours, I would have preferred the Cratchits' original plans for their Christmas meal. The fat of the goose has turned the meat into something almost melting.
We'll cut the breast meat first of all, but the skin is one of the glories of roasting in front of a fire. The trouble is there's not a great deal of meat on them, but it should be succulent, and gosh, that looks really good. It's not so much carving as flaking off.
Scrooge's purchase of the prize turkey does help to make the bigger bird more desirable, but it's too simple to say it was Dickens who changed that part of British Christmas and food culture. Commercial production of turkeys didn't start until the 1930s, and it was only in the post-war period the bird went mainstream.
Poultry isn't intensively reared in this country until we learn from the Americans how to do that. And geese apparently don't really take to intensive rearing in quite the same way. They need more space, they need water, you know, in a way that turkeys can be kept in quite intensive spaces. And so turkey probably becomes the thing that nearly everybody can afford from about the 50s onwards.
And with Christmas pudding, Dickens takes another food not particularly associated with Christmas, but helps make it so.
The history of the term Christmas pudding is quite old, but it's very, very rarely used. Plum pudding is what it was always called. There is one reference to it in the 17th century, just after the English Civil War, when a sailor from Kent boards a ship, and the ship sets off across the Atlantic, and it calls in at one of the Canary Islands to pick up water and provisions. And the victualler is absolutely drunk all the time and doesn't bring enough water on board and not enough food. And they have a complete disastrous journey, and they're starving because they just haven't got enough food or not enough water. Then they hit a storm as they get nearer the Americas, and a lot of people lose their lives, it capsizes, and then they end up stuck in Chesapeake Bay on an island, a boggy island that they can't get out of, with only about 6 survivors.
And it's at this point the cook finds enough ingredients to make a meal which is described in the ship's logbook as Christmas pudding, the earliest known record of the term being used.
But it doesn't ever get called that again until we get basically to the time of Dickens. It was always called plum pudding, but plum pudding was also eaten at other times.
So if you look at A Christmas Carol, there is no Christmas pudding mentioned anywhere in it. He talks about plum pudding, which is generally how that, round cannonball was known at the time. I think there were earlier references to Christmas pudding, but I think the first recipe for it comes just 2 years after, in Eliza Acton's book, came to be known as Modern Cookery for Private Families. And we know that Eliza Acton was a great Dickens fan because she names one of her other dishes after one of his characters, and she sent a copy of her own cookery book to him with a note. Anyway, she gives a recipe for what is called the Christmas pudding. And so it looks as though he's taking this plum pudding and anchoring it to this very specific day, to Christmas Day. And I think he's probably doing the same with the turkey. And this idea of the turkey, the big kind of, magnificent, meaty bird, and just anchoring it to one day of that kind of whole celebratory year.
The final food Ivan's prepared is that cake, the one seen under the ghost's left foot.
We talked about this 12 days of Christmas, and funnily enough, I actually have a 12th cake, which I've made and ornamented to show you what they look like.
Well, Ivan has just brought in a work of art, I think.
Extraordinary, just the most beautiful thing, which it would take a mere mortal, it would take about 3 months to make, but he probably kind of rustled up in the morning.
This isn't spoken about very much, but they were probably rarely made in a household. They were made by professional confectioners who were a very, very skilled profession.
There's a background icing, this deep pink, decorated with pale green and white kind of filigree icing. But what's really dramatic is there's 2 crowns on the top, like as though it was kind of icing metalwork. And it's the most beautiful regal cake I can imagine seeing.
And here you have a carving which shows a king and a queen, because the idea of Twelfth Day was to celebrate the Epiphany when the 3 kings come with gifts. So it sort of focused really on royals often. There's a wonderful engraving of a group of children sort of peering into a confectioner's shop, and you can see there's a giant cake in there. They can only dream of it. This is really something that the wealthy have, as their big party on Twelfth Day. But it dies, and it is born again by the 1890s and early 20th century is what we call the Christmas cake.
But we finish with a highly recommended delicious drink, one perhaps to use to toast a 12th night revival, Smoking Bishop. Ivan is pouring port into a saucepan.
When Pen's ready, she's going to put her toasted lemon in there.
While Pen is heating a lemon on the fire.
I'm going to put some cinnamon, and there's some ginger here. It tells you to use a race of ginger, which of course is a racine, as a root. In Dickens' time, getting fresh ginger like I've got here wasn't very easy. It tended to be a really hard, woody lump of ginger, but it delivered the flavour just as well.
But why, of all the drinks in Christmas Carol, Scrooge talks about Bob Cratchit's future over a Smoking Bishop? Why that particular drink?
Port was quite a gentlemanly drink. And I think one of the things that Dickens is saying that Scrooge has realised is that Bob Cratchit is a man like he is a man. And so it's quite a sort of flattering, it's quite a kind of tribute to him to say, I'm not just going to give you, some money for a pint of beer or something. I'm going to sit down and share.
Exactly. It's almost like an initiation, that suddenly you, like me, are a human and we're equals. Which is a wonderful moment in the book, I think. In the winter, in cold old Britain, there was nothing more comforting, really, than a hot alcoholic drink. It was probably the 18th, 19th century equivalent of sitting down and watching a nice film on Netflix, as a way of really relaxing.
Or the BBC, either.
Or the BBC, yes. Right.
Okay.
Smoking Bishop time, I think.
Cutting through the air, it's kind of the alcohol and the spices. I'd say it's quite medicinal as well, Ivan.
Well, that's how it starts. That's exactly how it starts. So let's have some Smoking Bishop.
and discuss our future affairs.
A little bit more. I'm not going to be miserly with it.
Thank you, Ivan.
Dan, there we go. And here we are. I suppose we've thought to say something, and well, God bless us everyone.
God bless us everyone. I think that could catch on. Perhaps we should try and revive the 12th. We could even call it Dickens Day. Perhaps it should become a day in which we bake a 12th cake, make some smoking bishop, which means that if you find time to read A Christmas Carol, you'll be able to conjure the flavours of John Leech's illustration and, I'd like to think, drink a toast to Dickens.
In June 1870, he had a seizure and was carried to bed. Early next morning, his breathing became fainter. He gave a deep sigh, a tear slowly trickled down his cheek, and the greatest humorist of the English-speaking world was dead. Out of the deep wound of his childhood, out of the divisions in his soul, where the criminal, the rebel, the saint, and the bewildered child kept uneasy company, his unsparing energy produced work that has enchanted generations of men in every part of the world. But we'll leave the last word on him to an outside witness, the Spanish-American philosopher Santayana.
I think Dickens is one of the best friends mankind has ever had. In every English-speaking home, parents and children will do well to read Dickens aloud of a winter's evening. They will love winter and one another and God the better for it. What a wreath that will be of ever-fresh holly thick with bright berries to hang to this poet's memory, the very crown he would have chosen.